We're lucky to have a lecture offered to us by two of my colleagues. Actually, one of my colleagues, Michael Bernstein, and his co-author, Ramesh Johari, is also here. And they are both colleagues that I have met very recently. I'm at the law school, and as was mentioned earlier, I'm co-director of the Stanford Cyber Initiative. And the Cyber Initiative was established a little under 2 years ago, thanks to a $15 million grant from the Hewlett Foundation. And the goal of the Cyber Initiative is not just to address policy issues in the cybersecurity space, but to think more broadly about how digital technologies are changing the economy and, in fact, all of our ways of life. And that really requires a multidisciplinary approach, and Stanford's a great place for multidisciplinary research, not just because of the strength across disciplines, but also because of the structure, the organizational structure of the university. The Cyber Initiative reports to the Dean of Research and the Vice Provost of Research, and so it's a university-wide program, just like our Woods Institute on the Environment is university-wide. And so because these organizations are not housed in a single school, it makes it very easy to encourage collaboration across schools. And the Cyber Initiative grant gives out research grants of about $1.5 to $2 million a year. And one of the conditions that we require is that the teams that receive these grants are multidisciplinary teams. And they are multidisciplinary teams that look into how digital technologies are transforming a social system. And the social system may be consumer markets, maybe democracy, maybe transportation, healthcare, and so on. And it has to be, in each one of these systems, it's broader than just cybersecurity. So take the democracy in our election process that's been talked about earlier today. You know, it's not just that the Russians might have the capability to hack into the election machines, the voting databases, and so on, but it's much broader than that. If you think about where we receive our campaign information, our election information, overwhelmingly now it is received through the internet. In fact, the information that we as citizens get about our candidates through YouTube is greater than the election-related information that has been received through CNN, through Fox News, through MSNBC, since each one of those networks started. In fact, it's 100 times more. So that although the regulation of elections controls what we receive domestically, what you receive over the internet is outside the control of the Election Commission. So it's quite possible that when you look at YouTube and there are videos that relate to the candidates, that's not actually coming from within the United States, it's coming from outside the United States. So the security, if you will, of our election system goes far beyond protecting the voting process. It goes in terms of the integrity of the campaign is being attacked or is vulnerable to attack from outside our borders because of the connectivity that the internet represents. Well, that's a long way of saying that the Cyber Initiative is quite determined to take a very broad view of security in each one of the systems. And one of the systems in which we are fortunate at Stanford to have some of the leading researchers is in the study of the workplace and employment and how that's being transformed by digital information. So Michael Bernstein is an assistant professor of computer science here, as well as a member of the Human-Computer Interaction Group. And his research focuses on the design of crowdsourcing and social computing systems. His co-author, Ramesh Johari, who's also here, is associate professor with a full-time appointment in the Department of management science and engineering, and courtesy appointments in computer science and electrical engineering. And he co-directs the Social Algorithms Lab, is a member of the Operations Research Group, also at Management Science and Engineering, the Information Systems Laboratory in Electrical Engineering, and the Institutional for Computational and Mathematical Engineering, also at Stanford. So without further delay, I wanted to invite Michael to speak about the project that they are doing along with other co-authors, and Ramesh will also be available in the Q&A that we hope will follow this interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Thanks a lot.
All right, please forgive the computer scientist's attempt to dress up. So this is work, as George mentioned, that is extremely collaborative. With me today is Ramesh Johari in Management Science and Engineering. I also want to give really big thanks to Melissa Valentine, my colleague also in Management Science, as well as Margaret Levy in Political Science. So you're going to see that this work touches on all of these kinds of issues. Now, we're here to talk, as George was indicating, a bit more broadly about what cyber is going to mean. That is, we've been talking a lot about the technologies and security of these kinds of things. But keep in mind that these technologies are not the only things in the room that are changing. You're not just trying to get stuff done under cyber threat. In fact, actually, the organizations that you are a part of are going to be shifting too. So technology is changing how you are going to be getting your work done at the same time that you're going to be trying to react to these external stimuli. So when we're talking about these sort of new forms of threat, I want to just take a moment and talk about how work security organizations are really much more interconnected than they ever have been before. And just give you a vision of the sort of next wave of change that you're going to be a part of in your organizations and firms in the next decade or so. So I hope that we'll get maybe a glimpse of what's coming. And here's what really animates me in this project. For the last, let's say, 50 years or so, the relationship between you and your computer has been fairly static. That is, you have some idea of something you want to get done, or maybe someone else in your organization, your boss or others have ideas, right? You turn to the computer, and the computer is a tool to get work done. You fire up PowerPoint, you fire up your data science tools, whatever it would be, and it is a tool to get work done. But that is shifting. Computation is now becoming a mediating layer between you and everyone else who wants to get work done or get paid for doing work. All of a sudden, the firms that you're used to being a part of are getting mediated digitally and computationally. If you wanted some concrete examples of this, look no further than Amazon's Mechanical Turk Marketplace, Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, DoorDash. Any of these sort of gig economy systems are just early examples of what's happening when a computer is going between people who want to get work done and pay money for it and people who are willing to do that work. And this could, in principle, become really large. Economists have estimated something like 20% of jobs in principle in the United States could be outsourced. And specifically, John Horton at NYU estimated something along the lines of about 45 million full-time jobs in the US alone that could go online down the wire in this kind of way. So what does this all mean? What are we doing about it? So far, everything you've seen looks a little bit like this. You may have heard of the term crowdsourcing. This was derived from the phrase outsourcing, where you took something that you used to give to another firm, and now you just sort of ask anyone to do it. In crowdsourcing, you take your task and you say, hey, anyone who's qualified, self-select, pick up whatever you want to do, and potentially I'll pay you for it. And largely this has been used so far for tasks that are distributed, independent, and low-skilled. So, think of things like labeling data. To a certain extent, I would argue that even something like Uber, anyone with a driver's license can do. Where the shift is going to happen, and where things are going to get really interesting, are when these bits flipped. I'm interested in asking what happens when we start creating computationally empowered work collectives that are no longer simple, they are far more complex, they're no longer distributed and independent, they are interdependent, and they're drawing on experts. Imagine if you could draw together the brightest minds in the world like that, as quickly as you could call a cab. What would you do if you could do that? So there are a lot of reasons why this would not work. There's a field known as organizational behavior that has spent its career detailing all of the ways in which we're really, really poor at organizing ourselves to get stuff done. So even if we could bring people together, there's a lot of reasons we would suspect this wouldn't work very well. Just like we're very poor at making estimates about probabilities, we have judgments and biases that don't quite work, so too are we very poor in general of thinking about how to organize ourselves to get things done. But these are very predictable patterns. And because of this, I see an opportunity, because a computer's in the middle, we have the opportunity to design that relationship just like I would have before designed PowerPoint or Excel or Google. I can design how the computer is organizing this work collective to be more effective. I'm going to give you a few examples of what this might look like. I'm going to start with something called Flash Teams. And here I'm really only going to focus on this first bit about asking what happens when the kinds of things you're used to seeing, maybe more with data labeling, starts drawing on experts. So I started with a question. Could we crowdsource the entire user-centered design process, starting with a napkin sketch of something you're drawing on your piece of paper right now, and give you a working, implemented, user-tested prototype in a day? This is the kind of thing that takes my undergraduate class about 10 weeks. I want to do it in a day. What I'd like to sort of start and convince you all of is that where this model on the left, as typified by marketplaces you may have heard of, like Amazon's Mechanical Turk, you can sort of get a bunch of people who are all, sort of have general cognitive equipment. They can all label data or look at pictures and tell you what's in them, etc. There are now marketplaces increasingly, such as Upwork or Freelancer.com, where you can, through an API, hire people with nearly any expertise you're looking for. Programmers, writers, marketers, musicians. I've hired an opera singer off of these platforms in the past. And now imagine what happens when a computer can fire off a call and hire someone on demand. So just to give you an example, what we've been developing are these things we call Flash Teams, which are these computationally guided teams of on-demand experts who have never met before, may never meet again, but are essentially scaffolded through a workflow process that the computer is guiding to accomplish some really complex and interdependent work. So imagine I give you a napkin sketch on the left. The Flash Teams software coordinates the group and draws it together. On the right, you can see the kind of output we might hope to get. The basic model behind this is actually not very complicated, and I won't get too much more technical than this in my talk. Essentially, all we need to do is have a series of steps, right? Just like any workflow you'd be familiar with, we can say, this can take a particular input and produce a particular output. Like you give me a napkin sketch, and I, as a UI designer, can create some lo-fi mockups. Or if likewise you give me some low-fidelity mockups and a heuristic evaluation, I can produce a high-fidelity prototype. And then the goal is essentially to pave the yellow brick road in between, right? So get from point A to point B by sort of cascading input to output to input to output to input to output. This should be familiar to most folks in this room. But now all of a sudden a computer has a representation of what this thing's trying to do. Here's a full one. Again, you would take in this napkin sketch, and it would take it through some low-fidelity prototypes, hand it off to an expert to give an evaluation, revise those high-fidelity prototypes, build a software prototype, run a user test, and revise the software, right? And because computation knows what's trying to happen, there's some really interesting and sometimes esoteric qualities that these teams have. For example, modularity. If I can have one of these teams, because of the size of the crowd, there's nothing stopping me from having 3 or 10 or 30 or as many as I want. I give these different teams different inputs, I get different outputs. So you have different sketches. By the way, all of these sketches are taken from my undergraduate class, so I'll correctly cite all of them. And everything you see on the right has been created by some of these Flash teams. Of course, something we talk about often in computer science is elasticity. This notion that, well, typically I might need 3 developers on these teams. I might predefine it to need 3 developers. But there's no reason why this really needs to be the case. Why don't I just by default have 1 and let the team elastically grow and shrink on demand as it needs to, right? Sort of autonomously let folks decide whether they need more help. Now, Mythical Man Month notwithstanding, the reasons you might want to do this are if the project is bigger than you might have expected, or if you have expertise that's necessary that's not already accessible on the team. Another example, another thing we do very commonly in computer science is pipeline. So here's this Flash team workflow that looks somewhat familiar. If you give me one more bit of information, which is that, well, you don't need to give me your entire design before I start telling you what's wrong with it. And likewise, I can probably start giving you parts of my design before I'm finished with the entire thing. And with this just a little bit more information, the system can automatically start to pipeline or compress the team so that things work a little bit more in parallel. Yes, this works faster. But the reason why this is actually a big benefit is when you're talking about these online labor markets, people are distributed worldwide, and this makes it much more effective because they can be in the same time zone, more likely. So here's a little more esoteric kind of a characteristic. Imagine that George has a napkin sketch of a design he's drawing because he's thinking about it in this room right now, and he wants to play with it. But he doesn't actually want a working prototype. He wants some sort of video animation describing the idea. He wants to, I don't know, do a Kickstarter or something and make lots of money. So we might not have a Flash team that we've seen before that can do this. But remember, each of those little blocks took inputs and outputs? If he told me the input he has and the output he's looking for, it might be that we could weave a team together from pieces of all of these different blocks that we've seen previously. And this is something that we can do actually by leveraging some rather old school technology out of artificial intelligence known as action planning languages. So we can transform these inputs and outputs into a structured language and do a very efficient search, which I won't get into here, but just for the most part, trust me, given the number of inputs and outputs we have, we can very quickly identify and construct a team that never before existed, but does exactly what you want it to do. So you're probably at this point thinking this is a little bit crazy, and also that how would you possibly coordinate these kinds of teams, right? We thought both of those things as well. And to solve at least the second one, we've been working on a web platform called Foundry, which seeks to help coordinate and author these Flash teams. Imagine this sort of as like being, the Microsoft Word or the PowerPoint or the Photoshop of Flash teams, where you author them. So imagine you had this idea. You would go into our system, and you would first create roles. We connect via API to these online marketplaces, so you describe the kinds of expertise you're looking for example, with tags from this Upwork marketplace. Then you go and create a series of these tasks, input to output. You can see the little gray arrows are connecting each task. And when you're ready, you say go. And at this point, Foundry essentially becomes a sort of a computational manager of a sort. And what it starts to do is give every worker on the team, it hires them, and it gives them each a link that they can log in as. So now let's say Ramesh logs in, he's a designer, and he sees something like this with his tasks highlighted saying, these are the things you're going to be responsible for as part of this broader picture. So again, he may have never met any of his teammates before, but because they have effectively defined roles, he knows exactly what he's supposed to do and who he's supposed to be giving it to. So he comes in, he starts working, and that updates to everyone else. Because he's an academic like me, he'll run late. That's okay, we do that. But eventually he'll finish and hand it off to the next person, and so on and so on. So in sum, what we're thinking about are ways in which we can build computational systems and interfaces that can actually let you author these kinds of teams, let them grow, shrink, reconfigure themselves, recruit on demand, and help people stay in sync with each other. Let me give you a sense that this might actually work. So really what I'm going to be showing you here are some proofs of concept. I've already demonstrated to you what these design teams look like. Here are some examples of the kinds of inputs that they took and outputs that they produced in about 1 day. And something on the order of $1,000. They produced working, user-tested prototypes. So imagine you had an idea right now. You sketched it up, you took a picture of it, you uploaded it. And you came back a day from now and were able to play with it. As a designer, that tightens that loop an incredible amount, allowing you to iterate much more quickly. But I know how to do this kind of thing. So we wanted to try something I'm not good at, which is animation, video animation. We brought a director off of Upwork and had him author another Flash team that would involve animators, voiceovers, et cetera, et cetera. And we needed an example. So my colleague, Terry Winograd in computer science, was retiring. So we had them make a 90-second or so video of Terry building a computer in his garage when he was a kid. So I'm about to show you this video that was created in 2 days, start to finish. Again, the team had never met before, probably will never meet again. They were given this. This is Terry. His sartorial style is somewhat Einsteinian. And what you're about to see is Terry building that computer in his garage. Oh, try again.
Good morning, son.
Oh, hey, Dad.
What the? What is that?
It's the future. It works.
The hands always get me. So this was about $2,000, 4 people, 45 hours total time, right? Imagine if your organizations could sort of elastically grow new kinds of expertise as it was needed and produce these kinds of things. We actually composed multiple teams together to build an entire online education platform, including videos, quizzes, and all sorts of things. So we really have some encouraging evidence that these teams are capable of some sort of rather impressively complex work together. Accenture saw this, and they decided they wanted to give it a shot. So they took our software, and they actually started running 3 teams of their own, including a marketing video that you can see on the left, a mobile application, and a business development video, all of which had to be up to their own, essentially, marketing team standards. And believe me, I'm not an expert at business. I'll leave that all to you. But what they reported to me was that the results took about something on the order of 1/7 the cost of their internal agency estimate. Now, there's clearly some wage arbitrage going on here, right? There's like overseas workers who are willing to work more cheaply. But I want to actually give you make a case that there's a lot more than this happening. And in particular, that they're much more effective or efficient. We ran an experiment. We gathered 6 teams randomly and randomized each one either into sort of this flash teams condition, as what I've described to you, or a control condition known as self-managed, where they come together and they're basically in a war room and they can work together however they'd like. And we gave them a task, which I'll describe in a minute. Flash teams looked exactly what I was just describing to you. These control teams just had the same length of time, but they were able to use it however they want. And what we did was we measured how many work hours collectively these teams took to accomplish the task. The flash teams took half as long, half as many work hours. The reason is that this software was essentially helping coordinate who was doing what and when. In the control teams, you had people stepping on each other's feet. They were firing each other, which is a really interesting emergent effect where one would get fired and then the software would automatically hire someone else, and then like 10 minutes later they have like a new person. So this team is continually turning over. But in fact, even the slowest flash team was faster than the fastest control team. So there's some evidence here that computation can actually play a role in helping teams coordinate. By the way, I've never run a study with 6 observations and gotten a statistically significant result. To which my colleague said, I aim for 4. So always can be one-upped. So what I hope I've convinced you so far is that there's this shift happening where computation is going to be playing a larger and larger role in what organizations look like. And it may be disaggregating a lot of what we typically have thought of as being sort of within the organization. Now, there are a lot of things these flash teams can't do yet, right? Only certain kinds of things can be predefined into workflows, right? We've only talked about a small team scale. What do you do with things that need to evolve or that need to be larger? These are ongoing questions that our team has actually been working on with the support of the Cyber Initiative. Now, I want to close by giving you some brief thoughts about what that future might entail on the other side. If flash teams are a new kind of work collective, like a new kind of organization, what's happening with the workers, right? What does collective action look like? Crowdsourcing in theory is like anyone can participate, when in reality, did you see any people inside there? No, because it's all sort of subsumed within the software, right? So we've been working on systems that allow workers to come together and more effectively essentially make their voices heard. So how would you think about, again, Uber drivers, these people who are incredibly distributed and never meet in one place, there's no water cooler, to actually think about and execute on what they want to do. So we've been developing platforms. They look a lot like the kinds of online platforms you've thought of. How could they come to consensus on some action they want to take, vote on it, figure out what they want to do, and actually put pressure when necessary? So when you do this, you start to get some really interesting effects. First of all, we did this with workers on these online marketplaces known as Mechanical Turk. You wound up with them telling academics how terrible we are. So they wrote a set of guidelines about how to do more ethical research on these platforms. The next thing they did was they wrote letters to Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, describing why they're on the platform and what they wanted to see happen. And as they wanted, they were actually able to get some media coverage on their perspectives. So I sort of want to probe there, a brief probe on like what's that future of like the worker ecosystem going to look like. Let's also think about what that future of education and ongoing training might look like, right? The problem is if I'm always getting paid freelance style to get work, I can't give up income in order to train myself to do new things, right? So now with this sort of new labor network, I basically can only do what I already can do. We've been experimenting with this notion of micro-internships, where you can imagine taking tasks that are already on these platforms and pairing someone who wants to learn something with someone who's already more effective at it. You can imagine that we might split the income from this, and that I might be able to then find a sort of a distributed mentorship network, right? So imagine that instead of just having one superior who's mentoring me over very long periods of time, I could potentially have 5 or 10 folks who I turn to for different kinds of mentorship at different times. So what does this all mean for security? Let me bring it back to the sort of, yes? Nothing. It means nothing for the future of security. How long has that been the case? Okay, well, let's see what happens. You don't need to see this effectively. It's fine. It said, hanging implications for security. I can see it. I don't know what your problem. So I would think about the following questions. When you have extremely permeable bounds on who's in your organization and who's out, and it's potentially as quick as a few hours or a few days, what do contracts look like, right? What about moles, right? People who come into your organization and are taking potentially private information, working with it for a few hours, and then moving over to other organizations and making use of that. It really messes with our notion of like what belongs to an organization versus what belongs to the worker. I would also think about a really important aspect of these platforms, which is reputation, right? You spend probably a lot of your resources finding and hiring great people. That is an extremely difficult challenge. Now, these online marketplaces essentially operate like Yelp. There's like 1 to 5 stars, right? It is very straightforward to subvert those systems, to try and essentially raise your own rating, right? Imagine I'm a worker. My hiring depends on my rating. I have a huge incentive to try and amplify it. Right? We need to think about what it would mean to design robust reputation systems that mean that there's a meaningful difference between 4.5 stars and 5 stars. Otherwise, it's going to be sort of like Yelp is now, where everything's basically the same. It's the Lake Wobegon moment. Everyone is above average. So, of course it is now. So I'll close with the following sort of thought, or at least provocation, that the future of work is going to change just as that future of cybersecurity is going to change. It's going to be far more complex and interdependent than it is today. People are going to be moving between lots and lots of different opportunities. There's going to be a lot of different expertise areas that people are going to draw together on demand. And I believe that whereas right now everything's happening in fairly well-defined challenges, give it a little time and you're going to see the ability to do essentially, I believe, what big organizations can do now, but far more rapidly, nimbly, essentially a labor force that can assemble and reassemble itself into nearly any shape and anything that it wants to do, right? And we can imagine that in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and that can be really fantastic and help you achieve your goals. You can also imagine that in other hands, those groups can execute far more complicated and interesting attacks than they can today, maybe even without the knowledge of the individuals in that group being aware of what they're doing. So there's a lot to be thinking about, and I'm happy to have this conversation. Ramesh is going to join me up here now. I think there's some Q&A, and then we'll close in just a few minutes. Thank you. Yeah.
So how are you handling or suggesting to handle the cyber risks of, passing, scanning off to some group in the Philippines and it happens to be the critical infrastructure for the city?
So can you just repeat the question?
Sure. So I think the question essentially is, how would you handle security in a situation where you're handing critical data off to third parties effectively that you're contracted with? I guess one thing I could comment on, I spent a year on leave from Stanford running the data science team at Upwork, which is the platform that Michael was talking about. One interesting thing, so back then it was called Odesk, one interesting thing about Upwork is that a large part of their own workforce is actually remote. The vast majority of development that's done is actually done by remote workers, so they essentially are using the platform for that purpose. And that obviously introduces a significant business risk. I'd say that actually, there are kind of two things that you rely on, one of which is scary and the other is less so. So one is social norms, right? And the interesting thing about the relationship, it's like, think about the relationships you have with your own employees. Yeah, you have contracts in place, and there are all kinds of ways in which you could sue people if critical information or sensitive information was released. But at the end of the day, a significant part of the relationship which governs how information flows is actually social norming of interaction. That's just as critical in remote work as it is in local physical work. But that is scary because obviously that's that kind of relies on society functioning well. The other I think critical piece of it is that, and this kind of comes out in what Michael talked about as well with Foundry. There's an important, with Flash Teams, there's an important sort of design component which goes into how you modularize the work. And just as in many sort of infrastructures that try to protect classified or sensitive material, in thinking about how you partition work between local and remote workforce, one of the things you have to determine is to draw the boundaries in a way where risk is mitigated further downstream, so that you're essentially containing the risk. That can be difficult, and I think that this is one of the most interesting questions, I believe, over the next several years as this becomes more the norm. Every organization is going to have to find its comfort zone in kind of where it draws that boundary. And as with many aspects of cybersecurity, I sort of expect that those boundaries are kind of going to be reactive. I suspect we'll draw them out further initially and end up reacting to that.
So I'll add just a few thoughts. Every major tech company already does this. Name it, really any of them. They are crowdsourcing aspects of their own business. Up until recently, when I think this was largely very visible because of the shift. Facebook was doing this with their sort of global topics you would see over, I guess for you, on the right. Google, this is how they get feedback on the performance of their search engine. They are really hiring contingent employees, essentially, elastically, to do this stuff. The way that they tend to do it is they have them sign NDAs on the way in. Now, how does that scale out when I'm signing 20 NDAs for different companies in the same week? It's probably going to turn out like terms of service do for any major website you use. But I think if there's a will, there will be a way. My general observation, I agree with Ramesh, has been that most of the workers on these platforms, they're really legitimately trying to make this work. Like they view themselves as freelancers. So I think the question is, how do we feel comfortable with it?
So my question was really, how do you build into the mediating software some surveillance over the level of business risk that's being assumed based on the tasks that are being modular?
So, one thing I guess I can comment on to that is that alongside, so these platforms that match for labor, they have a large component, which is the matching technology. And then, one of the things that I think distinguishes platforms like Upwork is that the entire work process can, in principle, be managed through the platform itself. So when Upwork started, when ONA started, one of the technologies that was very important that allowed them, to kind of flourish is that they provided, so first of all, there's something in the contractual terms that helped them, is that they were able to provide guarantees to both sides. So they promised a worker that an hour worked is something you're going to get paid for. They promised a client that, essentially what they're telling them is that if we tell you a worker worked an hour, they actually worked an hour. So the question became, how do they actually verify that? Now, it's not all the way to the question that you asked, but it's getting there. And what they had is essentially tracking software that was tracking keystrokes and mouse events, as well as screenshots periodically of what the worker was doing. And the idea was that, basically that minimal monitoring technology was enough to be able to say that, short of egregious Facebook surfing for the entire hour where we claimed that they were working, essentially you're responsible for paying the worker. And those guarantees mattered a lot because it basically meant that there was kind of a backstop that prevented the worker from being stiffed. And it sort of built trust in a kind of global sense across the platform. So you can imagine those types of tools expanding. One of the risks, though, and it really is, I think one of the hardest things for me, the hardest lesson for me to learn, but it's important for everyone to know up front, is that, these workers are not different than the workers you sit next to at your own desk. And so when you think about monitoring, you think about surveillance, I do think it's a dangerous road to think of those in different terms than we would think of them locally. Because I would argue that one of the things that probably sets up, a bad dynamic in the management remote worker relationship, and one which will end in low productivity, is precisely that distinction of treatment, where the remote workforce is sort of not. You can even think of it just, for many of you, I'm sure you have workers who are off-site, or other locations. There is a distinct difference in the nature of the management relationship, and I think every time that's amplified, it reduces productivity and cohesion. So I feel like that's something that, I think the same way that we're concerned about surveillance locally, I think we want to try to apply similar principles remotely.
I tend not to bet against active research areas. There's an active research area that thinks about how to essentially obfuscate parts of the input such that the worker can do exactly what they need to do, but sort of isolates them from risk of getting access to other things. Now, can that be hacked essentially? Always, yes. There's no way I can ever promise that there's any perfect system that would avoid that. But I would add that this question you asked is the exact same question that organizations used to ask about telephones. And after that, about instant messaging. And after that, about email, right? Anytime there's this sort of communication technology disruption within an organization, did I just say disruption? I just lost my computer science PhD. Whenever there is this change within communication technology within an organization, it's very easy to see the risks, but ultimately what happens is that the benefits sort of outstrip those considered risks and people start adopting it.
So the worker next to you is not any different than the worker across an ocean or around the world. Do you see research efforts, or will your research talk about artificial intelligence and software that replaces workers, so that the ultimate thing here is a system that is mediated by software, which is all software, and are the kinds of tasks that you're looking at for people to do with what you're talking about easily replaceable by technology?
I'm optimistic on this count. Our AI is going to continue to get better. But whatever AI can do, there are things that people can do that will always outstrip it. So I'm most interested in thinking about flipping it the other way and asking how AI can make people more effective in their coordination.
The human technology interaction.
That's right. Now, inevitably, right, the data that's being collected by these workers can be used to train artificial intelligence algorithms to maybe take on some of the easier versions of these. And guess what? I think at the end of the day, the workers are going to be happier about that too, right? Because they're not doing the most brain-dead parts of the job, and they're able to focus on the more creative parts. So I think it will continue to evolve, but I don't think that day is tomorrow.
Yeah, and one thing I want to emphasize is that there is always an interface between humans and technology, but the interface here is particularly interesting because we're just very bad at describing what we want. So you think about the process that Michael described. The input is like a napkin sketch. What are you looking for? And the analog of that in many of the other complex tasks you might use remote work for, we're terrible at. Right? I mean, if I want a web app, I'm terrible at describing what I want it to look like. I know what I don't like, but it's very hard for me to tell you what I like. And so I think that one of the reasons why I think there will continue to be the kinds of challenges that are described here is while the interface may change and the sophistication of the modules may evolve, there's always going to be that interface where we're bad at describing what we want, and somehow the system will need to respond to that. There was a question back there also.
So this all makes sense. I love the idea, but I guess the question I have is, how do you protect IP in that kind of scenario, right? Because that to me is, the crown jewel of any software development process, right? You're outsourcing it to somebody who needs that same IP, and now you have IP litigation.
I can tell you how it works now, which is that since this is all work for hire, the IP all belongs to the person who paid for it. Sorry?
That was easy.
Yes.
Was easy. But I'm sitting out there, I developed a package that I submit to you. You put it as part of your code. New work comes around, I go take that same piece of software and give it to another company that's developing that. Now, it's hard to come back to me. You're the one that's going to be held accountable for that IP.
Mm-hmm. Well, or the company will be, right? This is what Microsoft was always very worried about, is people using open source code somewhere inside of Windows, and then the entire Windows code base has to become open source. Yeah, I think that this is going to be. I think that people are going to make missteps here. I think Ramesh's analysis of this is pretty spot on. Like, it's going to be fairly reactive. I suspect, in the best case, what will happen is that it will encourage more middleware, so to speak, to be sold and or shared, which are the things that are in fact shared across tasks. Much in the way that, say, IDEO, a design consultancy, builds up infrastructure and tools that makes them better at what they want to do. Another thing that you can imagine that these workers might themselves build up tooling that makes them better at their jobs that they hold and don't particularly give to any of their clients. So it's going to be interesting and messy. So in this case, I think, if you have a very strong feeling about the IP, you can certainly use contracts to make sure it happens. But I think that right now we haven't seen the level of what you're discussing, and I don't know how it's going to play out. It's a wonderful question.
But one thing, if I just add to that, though, I do feel like at some level this is going to come down to value versus cost. I think that what's happening is that the value proposition of remote work is increasing. This is a huge risk and therefore a cost. One potential emerging kind of technology that can deal with that is essentially distributed certification of IP, so that they're kind of. If you look at it from the worker's perspective, right, they also don't want to be in a position where they can't certify the work that they've done and they can't claim credit for it. So actually, potentially a reasonable solution to this might be something where there's better decentralized certification of IP that actually is a platform in and of itself. And there have been some research efforts in that direction. I would say nothing that's mature enough to be a commercial platform yet.
So we have time for one last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm just curious because we're in a law school and there's a lot of lawyers. This sort of seems like it would have a lot of implications for professional services firms. Like, current modern law firm is lawyers scattered all over the world, and they never do that great job of sharing their stuff. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts about how this might have implications for law firms someday?
Well, I haven't really thought about it, but off the top of my head, we do know that law firms outsource a lot of stuff in the offshore, audit tasks, discovery tasks, document review, document preparation, and so on. They're offshoring it. They have a relationship with the firm or the people or the groups that they offshore it with, and to the extent that a platform like this can address the needs that a relationship serves, reputational, the knowledge transfer that happens between two parties when they constantly deal with each other, then it could definitely it's going to be the sort of thing. Not all tasks are going to be able to be done this way, but I can see some that can be done very discreet. And the confidentiality is obviously going to be important in this case too.
Yeah, I've talked a bit with a startup in the city called Up Counsel, which is which essentially is an on-demand platform for legal. And it's interesting because it's exactly kind of like what George got at. There's some threshold at which tasks can be described in a way that they work in that model, and then you cross that threshold, and you need the traditional services of a law firm. And there's both where that boundary lies and also kind of how attorney-client privilege and things like that get managed. And I think we're still very, very much in the early days of understanding what that might look like.
I can tell you what I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, George.
So if I just add, I think describing the task has been key for a well-received automation. And that is, I think what Ronald Coase, the Nobel laureate, said about when are some tasks bundled together in a firm and when are they done by contract. The difficulty of doing everything by contract is it's very hard to specify what we need. When I'm hired here as an employee, the dean doesn't have to sit down and specify everything that I need to do task by task. That would be incredibly difficult. In an employment relation, you don't have to do that. And that's going to continue to be a problem here if we just specify the tasks.
I'll add just one final thought here, which is that I think there's going to be increasing tension between essentially holding knowledge and knowledge as sort of having value there. When you've seen technology fail within a firm, often the problem, and here not just a legal firm, but like any organization, often the problem is that it's trying to incentivize or enable knowledge sharing in a sort of knowledge economy in which I get ahead by having more knowledge than everyone else. Right? Why are wikis within organizations mostly dead? It's because, in most law firms or big consulting organizations or something, like I actually get ahead by knowing more than everyone else, so why would I share it? And you can imagine that there's going to be similar dynamics here where maybe in the best case, I'm in a law firm, I'm an attorney, and now I have this entire on-demand elastic army that can help me be more effective than everyone else. On the other hand, everyone in my army now sort of has an incentive to make themselves as irreplaceable as possible, right? To have knowledge that no one else could swap in to help. And I think that tension is going to drive a lot of interesting developments in the next few years.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.